This presentation, by that it means they're underwriting Vince Feeney to be here, by the Vermont Humanities Council through its Speakers Bureau program. In addition to providing events such as this one, the Council sponsors reading and discussion programs, a wide variety of literacy programs, and other events statewide. Quite a lot of other events. Humanities Council is dedicated to creating a state in which every individual reads, participates in public affairs, and continues to learn throughout life. So, welcome. And we're really pleased and looking forward this afternoon to hearing from Vincent Feeney. Vincent Feeney lives in Marshfield, Vermont, had lived in Winooski, had been an adjunct professor at the University of Vermont for some time, and for 20 years or so, and also was in the real estate business in Burlington during these past several years, which is a good place to be and be in that business at that time. He comes from California, was born and raised in San Francisco, went to San Jose State College in California, came east to the University of Vermont to do a master's degree, and unfortunately got drafted while he was here. Ended up in Vietnam, and but returned to get a doctorate at the University of Washington on the subject of Irish history, and came back to Vermont, which he had gotten a taste of and liked, and we've been talking a lot about that, about why or how some of us got here. His is a typical story, seeing a place, people that he liked, and making a decision to be here for his life's work. And so, welcome, Vincent Feeney.
Well, it's nice to be here, and it's nice to see so many old friends. I talked to Tim O'Connor here a year and a half ago, to Steve Baker on the phone, and then, lo and behold, I run into an old friend from Winooski days, Mark Tigan, who lives now across the river in New Hampshire, but you guys don't talk to people from but anyhow, it's wonderful to be here just a few days before St. Patrick's Day. Now, the title of my talk is The Irish Wave in the Green Mountains, and the title isn't original with me. It actually comes from the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who noticed in his researches that, after the Great Famine, the Great Potato Famine of the 1840s, that what you saw here in the Northeast was this great wave of immigrants. And sometimes that wave, as all waves do, and hopefully waves in Japan will do this, they recede, right? And so you'll have this big surge, this big influx of immigrants, and then it'll slow down. And I certainly saw that here with the Irish in Vermont. Now, in talking about the Irish in Vermont and writing about the Irish, I wrote this book a couple of years ago on the Irish in Vermont, and the Boston Globe had a little blurb about it. And they said, rightly so, when you think of the Irish in America, you don't think of Vermont, right? We think of Chicago, New York, Boston, and some of you who know the West, you think of San Francisco, where San Francisco in 1870, 35% of the population, 35% was born in Ireland, because just as the West, California was opening up the gold rush, that's just when all these immigrant Irishmen showed up, and a single fellow with nothing really going for him, right, just took off and went west and tried to luck out there. Now, I have prepared a talk that I give all over the state, right? And it's a little bit of a can talk. And some of you who were there at the book signing at the one of your local bookstores about a year ago might say, it's a little bit redundant. But what I thought I'd do, in addition to that can talk, is that I would, because I had done some specific research on Brattleboro, I thought that I would just kind of share a few things about that, which you would find particularly interesting. Now, one of the things that I had found, and I'd forgotten about this. This was an article that appeared in Vermont History, from the Journal of the Vermont Historical Society. It's an article that appeared back in 1976, and what it was apparently Bishop Michaud, right, our second bishop of the Catholic Diocese of Burlington, that is the whole state of Vermont, but the Diocese of Burlington. When he became bishop, when he was a coadjutor bishop, actually kind of running the diocese in the 1890s, because de Gosbriand, the actual bishop, was elderly, couldn't maintain do all the work. But anyway, so Michaud sent out a questionnaire to all the parishes around the state because he wanted to know more about the history of these parishes. And so he sent out one of these questionnaires to the priest here at St. Michael's. The priest was Patrick Cunningham. I'm not going to do the whole questionnaire. If you have time sometime, you have to look this up. It's in the 1976 issue. But there's one line that I thought was just fun and so indicative at that time that I thought, I have to read this. Right? The question that the bishop asked of the parish priest was, what is the political, social, intellectual, and business standing of your people? In other words, how are your people doing? So this Father Cunningham answers, in politics, the Catholics here, with few exceptions, are in heart and sympathy Democrats, and hence have no political standing or hope of reward. Times do change. Well, that took a long time. Governor Hoff, right, in the 1960s, right? He was our first Democrat.
I was just wondering if you would say what year that was.
That was 1898. That questionnaire. Okay. I'd also, through the course of all my research, and I did this with a lot of towns, I looked at in a very detailed way at the 1870 census. It was a census that I particularly found useful. It was only in 1850, for example, in the census that was taken, the U.S. Census, that the enumerators were asked to list place of birth. So before 1850, it's kind of hard to know, how many French Canadians you might have, how many Irish people, born in Ireland you might have. But moreover, too, they only named head of household. So if you were a French Canadian, for example, farm worker, right, and you worked for Jonathan Stewart, I'm thinking of Jonathan of the Daily Show, right? You would only show up as a person living in Stewart's household. Okay, so you really didn't get a lot of information. But the 1870 census, I liked it because not only did you get the place of birth, but you got the names of everyone in the family and where they were born. So you got kind of two pictures. You got a picture of the actual immigrant people, the man and the women, and maybe their children who came from Ireland. But you also got a picture of the children who were born either in the United States or, in the case of Vermont, in Canada. That's not so true of Burlington, but if you go up to further northern Vermont, most of the Irish up there, right, came through Canada. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So here's the 1870 census. Here's some of the facts I came up with for Brattleboro. Okay. First of all, in 1870, we had just under 5,000 people in Brattleboro, in the town of Brattleboro. Right? Of those, a little bit less than 5,000, 310 were born in Ireland. And they had, living at home, 275 children, okay, born either in Canada, Vermont, or in another state. And that's a little bit under 12% of the population of Brattleboro are in those two generations. Now, clearly, there are some children who've grown up already and moved out of the home, and they would just show up as, Joe Hurley, born in Vermont, and so it'd be hard to, except for the name, it's kind of a giveaway, but it'd be hard to know, are they really of an Irish background. So my best estimate is that in 1870, probably somewhere between 15 to 20% of the population came from an Irish background, right? So that's a pretty good chunk of the population, and that's not, Brattleboro was not even within the first 5 towns in Vermont in terms of percentage of population. And yet it's a pretty significant population. Now, what were they doing? Right? And this is kind of fun. I broke this out by the occupations that were given. For the men, the most common occupation was day laborer. A day laborer was someone who simply hired out by the day. You know, what came to mind for me, you know, if you've been to the Southwest or say Southern California, you know, and there would be a certain street corner in town, if you're in Santa Fe or in Albuquerque, where you'll have 10 Mexican Americans just waiting for a pickup job. These were Irish in 1870, waiting for that daily work, because there were other working men who described themselves as laborer as opposed to day labor. So they actually had an ongoing job of some kind. The next biggest category, though, after day labor, this is interesting. There were 51 day laborers. There were 48 men who worked in the insane asylum. And I'm afraid to tell you, I didn't take the statistics on this. There were also a few of the patients there who came from Irish background. And then you had a sprinkling of you know, different trades. You know, you had a coachman, one. You had 2 or 3 blacksmiths. You had a tailor. There was one tailor. There are 2 shoemakers. You know, so they're kind of spread out. What you don't find, and I found this interesting, not many farmers. Not many farmers here. Whereas you get up to Franklin County in the north, and that's probably the most common occupation was farmer. So that's interesting. I found that. What's also interesting too, you know, we think of the railroad was the big employer, and it certainly was in Brattleboro in the 1840s and the 1850s, but not in 1870. I only had 4 people that put down, 2 put down railroad worker and 2 put down railroad firemen. You know, I think these are the people that are shoving the coal into the steam engines, right? And that was rather surprising, although one could probably argue that the men who describe themselves as laborers probably did railroad work, right? But it paints an interesting picture. Now, what about women? There were 60 women who reported jobs outside the home, because this is a time when once you married, you didn't work outside the home, right? So these are 60 women who actually reported jobs outside the home. It's interesting, when you did have a couple, you know, and the family listed it, then, you know, you'd have the husband, and he would say, you know, railroad worker or works in the insane asylum, and the woman, it would say keeping house, right? Meaning that she stayed home and took care of the home front. But the 60 of the 60 women, though, that worked outside the home, 44 were servants. Okay, they are the domestic servants. Right? But other jobs they held are really just kind of allied, and one could probably argue with basically kind of domestic servants. There were 6 that were cooks. There were 4 that were either washer women or laundresses. There was 1 table waiter, 2 housekeepers. I don't know what the distinction between housekeeper and servant was. 1 chamber girl and 1 PA cook. I have no idea what that was. Women are interesting at this is kind of a juncture date, 1870. What was very clear in later census reports that I saw is for the generation that's born in America, like that first generation of Irish American women in Vermont, they're clearly their parents didn't want them to go into domestic work. These domestics are primarily the women that were born in Ireland, come here as young girls, and they've got nothing going for them. And working in domestic service was a good place to be, right? You got a clean house, to be a warm house to be in. You got kind of a protective family, and in most cases, I'm sure. You got a steady, if minimal, income, and in many cases, the domestic servant got a uniform, so you didn't have to go out and buy a lot of clothes. And what you find is that these women working in domestic service, they're the ones saving money they're the ones sending money back to Ireland. They're the ones giving money for the church, as was very true of St. Michael's here. St. Michael's, the Catholic Church, right? Since John pointed out to me that both the Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church are named St. Michael's, which would drive a lot of people nuts coming in from out of town. The big occupation that you see of that first generation of Irish-American young women is school teachers. You know, the cliche of, in America has always been the Irish cop, the Irish fireman, and that's certainly true, right? But the other cliche is the Irish female school teacher, right? They go into teaching with a passion. Many of them never married, because if you married, right, you lost your teaching job. You were out on the street, right? But a lot of them, Irish women, as you probably know, and some of you probably know better than others, very independent, strong-willed women. A lot of them remained unmarried and taught the rest of their life. So anyhow, I just wanted to give you that brief little picture. In talking about Vermont in general, I have to begin by saying the Irish have always been here. One of the earliest people I came across, I was going through a list of the town representatives of Vermont at the convention, I think it was in Bennington in 1791, that voted to come into the federal union, to accept the Constitution of the United States and become the 14th state. Right? At that convention, I was going through the names of the different representatives of towns, and one of the names I come across was a guy named Michael Flynn, 1791. Well, this is amongst a bunch of names that are, like Ira Allen, it would be a Jonathan Spafford, these great Yankee names, right? So Michael Flynn jumps right off the page, right? And so I tried to learn about as much as I could about this man. And here's what I came up with, and kind of an interesting story. His grandfather was an Irishman named Richard Flynn, who came to North America, to the American colonies, sometime before 1723. This is very early on. What's also interesting is it's right at the 1600s, the century preceding, had been a very, very bad time for Irish Catholics. It's when the English government finalizes its conquest of Ireland, right? It was a very bad time for Irish Catholics. I suspect, because this is an old Irish name, Flynn, that this Richard Flynn somehow gets out of Ireland, right? 1700, 1710, comes to the American colonies. He's in Billerica, am I pronouncing that right? Billerica, Massachusetts, where he marries, because in 1723, he and his wife have a son, also Richard Jr. Okay? The family shortly thereafter that moved to Woodstock, Connecticut, which Woodstock, Connecticut at that time was part of Massachusetts. A border shuffling that takes place later on, right? Which was kind of a frontier, right? It was probably inexpensive land to buy. Young Richard grows up. His parents, that is the Irishman and his wife, right? They actually died. They're drowned crossing a river, right? This is a time when, we have the conveniences, all these wonderful bridges. They didn't, right? So they sometimes took their chances, and I think they drowned on the Charles River trying to cross it at one point. Anyhow, young Richard grows up in Woodstock, Massachusetts. He is a pillar of the Congregational Church there. The way I look at it, he's becoming, that is, the family's becoming Yankee. His mother may have been a Yankee background. And it's a time when, in fact, if the family had been Catholic at some point, there's no Catholic churches in the colonies. Well, there is down in Maryland, right? You would have found some. But the first Catholic church, well, I know the first Catholic church in Massachusetts is Holy Cross in Boston that is established, I think, in the 1780s, right? It's also a time when, to be a member of a community, you have to be a member of that whatever church is in the community. And of course, for New England, that's predominantly congregational, right? So the family of Richard Jr. now is congregational. he marries, and his son, Michael, the one that I'm leading up to, is born in Woodstock, Connecticut, well, what would that be? Probably around 1755 or so. He fights in the American Revolution, is a staunch Congregationalist, and when the New Hampshire grants are opening up, when Benny Wentworth is selling off grant lands up here in the frontier, right? Michael Flynn comes up to Bethel, Vermont, and bought a lot of land, settles there, marries, and in the documents that I saw in the 1790s in the Betheltown records, he's referred to as Squire Flynn. Now, here's a person whose grandfather was Irish, right? My sense is that Michael probably had no sense of Irish culture. He's as Yankee as any other Yankee by the time he gets to adulthood, because his grandparents were long since dead. Right? So you have in Vermont, as I suspect you had all throughout New England, these individual characters who very early on had become Yankees, lost all sense of Irishness. Now there is one community also worth mentioning at this early date, and this is the community associated with Londonderry, Vermont. Right? What's interesting about them is they are descendants of the Scots-Irish of the north of Ireland. People don't realize, many people don't realize this, but roughly from 1700 down to the end of the 1700s, the Presbyterians of Ireland were as discriminated against almost as much as the Catholics, right? Because they were dissenters. That is, they did not adhere to what in Ireland is called the Church of Ireland, which is simply the Anglican Church in Ireland, right? And so they were discriminated against. And what made things worse is they had to compete with Irish Catholics for a little plot of land to work, to grow your potatoes in. And the Irish Catholics were so desperate to have a little piece of land that they would rent that piece of land for ridiculous rents. And a lot of these Scots, they're called Scots-Irish, of course, because their ancestors came from Scotland over to Ireland. And so these Scots-Irish Presbyterians, maybe because they were smarter than the Irish, I don't know, they said, the heck with this. We're going to, why try to work this tough soil and compete with the Catholics? We're going to go off to America. So many of them do, and apparently around 1718, 1790, a few boatloads from Londonderry, Northern Ireland, Coleraine, Northern Ireland, that area up in the northwest, right, come to Boston. Unfortunately, the Boston, they're all Congregationalists, right? And they don't particularly like the Scots-Irish. They don't particularly like Presbyterians, right? They have a different religious ethic. So these Scots-Irish Presbyterians decide to strike out to a frontier where they can be free, that they can practice their religion without any hassle from the authorities. So they go up to what was then the frontier. They go up to and establish Londonderry, New Hampshire. That's where they first settle. They are extremely successful there. Some sources say that they are the ones that introduced the potato to New England, and that they became kind of the preeminent linen weavers, that they grew flax and became preeminent. And of course, they had a long history of that in Northern Ireland. Their settlement there grows, prospers, so much that by the 1750s, 1760s, there's too many of them, and they begin to send out satellite communities. And one of those satellite communities that gets established is Londonderry, Vermont, right? Although by now, right, we're a couple generations away, removed from Ireland, so they are pretty much Yankee Americans by the time they come to Vermont. As a sidelight, I always like to mention, I had known, because for a time doing research, I lived in Northern Ireland. I knew that the name Aiken was very much a Scots-Irish name, and we found it a lot in Aiken. So I called up Burr Morse, who is related to, is a descendant of Senator Aiken. And I asked Burr, I said, do you know if the governor, call him the governor because that's what his wife always refers to him as, was of Scots-Irish background? He said, well, let me get back to you then. So a couple days later, he got right back and he said, yeah, you know, he talked to some of the people in the family who were more familiar with the family records. He said, oh yeah, they came from Coleraine, originally settled in New Hampshire, and then a bunch of them came over to the Londonderry kind of Dummerston area down there. And I just thought that was an interesting connection, right? Here's someone of that Scots-Irish background. Another person from that early period who's worth mentioning, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, is, of course, Matthew Lyon, right, the indentured servant who comes to this country from probably County Carlow, just south of Dublin, in the 1750s, settles in Litchfield, Connecticut, and becomes friendly with that rowdy crowd in Litchfield, Connecticut, like Ethan Allen and his brothers, you know, Ira, Levi, and Tom Chittenden, who are all going up to the New Hampshire grants, and he, once he gets his freedom, he continues on, and of course becomes our outspoken congressman in the 1790s, so outspoken against the Adams administration that he gets thrown in jail under the Sedition Act, spends a few months in jail while he's actually a congressman, and while another election takes place, and the good people of Vermont re-elected him to Congress while he's in jail. There's a sideline in this story that I tried to track down, but there was a man that called me once and he said, you know, Matthew Lyon was brought to jail, I think he was brought to jail in Rutland, in a steel cage. I said, you know, in Roman times, the Romans used to do that. You know, you'd capture a opposing king, and you know, you'd bring that king in a cage through the streets of Rome, so everyone could throw rocks at him and so on. You know, and this person I was talking to, I forgot his name, was not a crank. It was someone that had a strong history background and came from an educated background. I said, no. He said, you can see it. And I said, you're kidding. And I said, well, where is it? He said, it's behind. He said, go to, you know, Deniker Chevrolet in Virgins. I said, yeah, I know where it is. And he said, there's a lot next to it. He said, go to the back of the lot. So one time, I drove down. I mean, I had some business. I go down there, and sure enough, there's this rusting steel cage in the back of the lot. And I asked a couple of my friends who, you know a lot of Vermont history, and they had never heard. Now, I don't know if there's any truth to that story, but I'd love to be able to track that one down. Matt Lyon, too, was a wild character, right? As I said, you know, the one that gets in a fist fight on the floor of Congress. And I actually give for the Humanities Council, I give a talk on Matthew Lyon, and when I was talking with the Humanities Council about this talk initially, you know, I said, well, what do you want for a title? And I said, how about this? Before there was Bernie, there was Matt. They didn't like that. They thought I was too political and I should stay away from it. So I didn't do it. By 1800, 1815, we have a lot of Irish people in Vermont, of Irish background, but it's spotty. I don't think we could even attempt to come to a percentage. But after 1815, you really begin to see an increase of emigration from Ireland that does have an impact on Vermont. Now why after 1815? What's happening then? In 1815, you have the end of the wars of the French Revolution and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, right? And Ireland had done fairly well while those wars were going on. Number one, Ireland is an agricultural country. It was kind of the breadbasket for the British military, soldiers and Navy. You know, salted beef, preserved beef, Irish beef was going to those troops. So the economy did fairly well. Secondly, a lot of those soldiers in the British Army were Irish, right? And a young man not going anywhere, right? Would gladly take the king's shilling, right, to have a job. And a lot of the Irish fought in those armies, a lot in Wellington's armies. And of course in 1815, everything kind of collapses, right? Those troops are demobilized, so you have a lot of Irishmen coming back out of the army. At the same time, as we all know, after major wars, you often have a recession. The economy's built up during the war, and then it collapses because demand goes way down. Furthermore, the textile industry in Ireland was changing. Most of the textile industry up to 1815, 1820 was simply a home-based industry, right? A putting out industry where someone might bring the wool around to women in their cottages, and so in the winter months, the women might spin, the men might weave. But as you have the growth in Belfast in particular of textile mills, the factory system emerging, you have a decrease in income in the rural areas. So you also have, then times get tougher. So you begin to see a very large increase. This is the pre-famine years into North America. What's interesting about this pre-famine bunch, now this is, I'm going to talk about the period 1815 to up to the famine, 1844, 1845, is it is increasingly Catholic in orientation, right? Whereas in the 1700s, that had been primarily Scots-Irish Presbyterians, right? 1815 to 1845, most of the immigrants now are going to be Catholic. The other interesting thing about this group coming in is they come to North America primarily through Canada. And this is why actually Brattleboro doesn't fit the pattern too much, because Brattleboro's Irish come more with the railroads, right? And they tend to be more the famine Irish. The Irish leaving in the period that I'm talking about, they come via Canada because Canada had a trade going on with the British Isles where lumber was going to the British Isles, and those ships had previously been just deadheading back empty. So with a little bit of money, you could re-outfit them in British or Irish ports, put people in them, and send them west. Secondly, Britain was encouraging immigration to Canada, right? Canada still is underpopulated, right? That massive, massive country, and just about everyone lives right next to the border, and the rest of the country is back country. So to encourage people from the British Isles to come to Canada, they created a tariff on passenger tickets to the United States, and either no tariff or a low tariff for ships coming to Canada. Thus the Irish were coming into Halifax, they were coming into St. John's, New Brunswick, they were coming into Quebec City, to Montreal. I came across an interesting fact that surprised me, even though I knew a lot of Irish were coming in, and that is that in the 1830s, English became the dominant language, temporarily, right, in Montreal, because there were so many Irish coming in. Eventually, many of those Irish would marry nice French girls or Frenchmen and become French Canadians, right? So they're pouring into Canada, and many of them, right, not wanting to live in Canada, because actually opportunities were very, very limited in Canada, much more so than in the United States. So a lot of them just kind of kept going. If they got off in Halifax, they might continue on another boat down to Boston. Or if they got off in Quebec City or Montreal, they might get on, they might take the railroad car that started in the 1830s from just on the south bank of the St. Lawrence outside of Montreal that went over to Chambly, and then they'd catch a steamer coming up the Richelieu into Lake Champlain. And many Irish immigrants, the first time they touched soil in the United States was in Burlington. Hard to imagine, right? There was a customs house in Burlington. I mean, it was an international port. Now, having said that, I want to read something from my favorite Irish author. I'm sure I can find it. Not this description. Let's see. Oh, okay. Is that Nathaniel Hawthorne, right? who's later on going to write the Scarlet Letter. He visits, as a young man, he visits Burlington about 1832. The way he made his living as a young writer was to write these little travelogue pieces that he would then sell to magazines. So a piece that he wrote about Burlington appeared in a magazine in 1835, and the piece was titled "The Inland Port," where he gives his impressions of what Burlington was like in the early 1830s. And here's what I write. In a short sketch published in 1835, Hawthorne recorded his impressions of Burlington. He remarked on the lofty outline of the Green Mountains to the east of the village, the curved, sandy beach at the bay, the wharves and warehouses at the water's edge, the handsome and busy square, now City Hall Park, at the center of the town, the presence of houses roofed in tin in the fashion of Montreal, and the large brick customs house, which reminded him that this inland port is a port of entry, largely concerned in foreign trade and holding daily intercourse with the British Empire. In this international setting, Hawthorne noted, people from everywhere in North America could be found, merchants from Montreal, British officers from the frontier garrisons, French Canadians, Scotchmen of a better sort, of a better class, gentlemen of the South on a pleasure tour, country squires on business, and a great throng of Green Mountain boys with their horse-drawn wagons and ox teams, true Yankees in aspect, and looking more superlatively so by contrast with such a variety of foreigners. But nothing impressed Hawthorne more about Burlington than the great number of Irish immigrants to be found there. In his unflattering description, they were everywhere, lounging around the wharves, swarming in huts and mean dwellings near the lake, and elbowing the native citizens out of work. If his words hinted of Yankee prejudice, they were at least on the mark in one respect. Burlington did have a large Irish population. It's impressive, right, to hear that the early 1830s, there are a lot of Irish living in Burlington. There's also an area where Irish just flooded in, and even to this day has a very strong kind of Irish mark on the land, is in Franklin County, particularly the town of Fairfield. You know, if some of you know that area, this is the area that well-known farming family, the Howardgans, the late Francis Howardgan was very prominent in agricultural circles in the state, and was in the, either represented Fairfield or was a senator, I'm not sure which, but there are slews of Irish families up there, and it's understandable, right? These people that are kind of escaping Ireland, right? And they get to Canada. Actually, the Howardgans stayed in Canada for about 10 years because three of the couple that came over, 3 of their children were born in Canada. You kind of track their journey, but then they come down and they settle in Fairfield, and in a pattern that historians have called chain migration. You know, once you have one immigrant family in an area, you're probably going to have other immigrant families coming in. Right? So Franklin County gets a lot of Irish simply because they're so close to Canada. Now, the famine years, you know, we get up to the mid-1840s, and just to give you kind of a brief background on the famine. The potato famine, the potato itself, right, was the principal staple of consumption for the Irish peasantry. As someone once remarked, you know, that one of the nice things about the potato is you can prepare it in so many different ways, right? You get potato soup, you get potato pancakes, although my wife's got me making latkes now. I don't think the Irish do latkes. You know, it's a food that you can prepare in a lot of different ways, and then with milk and maybe butter, you can have a pretty nutritious meal. It was also, in Ireland, it was always called the lazy root. Didn't take a lot of work, you know, so you could be off doing other kinds of chores while this potato was growing. And in the 1840s, the historians have estimated that the average per capita consumption of potatoes was about 8 pounds a day. Average per capita. per capita consumption. Totally dependent on, unlike other countries. I mean, the Germans, in the Germanies at the time, they consumed a lot of potatoes, but it wasn't the only food. They had other things too that they could have consumed. Now, the Irish peasant had some other things. You know, they might have livestock and so on. But most of the other things that they grew or raised went to pay the rent. You know, what you lived on was the potato. Well, in 1845, that autumn of 1845, the crop is attacked by a spore that probably came from America because there had been a crop failure in New England just a year or two before, and so the theory is that maybe that spore had been carried in clouds across the Atlantic and then dropped in the summer of 1845. It was very wet in Ireland, dropped in the soil and it attacked the potato crop. The crop fails in 1845, but as one would expect, it's not yet disastrous for the Irish people. Right? You might have a little bit of money put aside, a little bit of reserves, or your relatives might be able to help you out, but it fails again in 46. Now there's no cushion, right? And all of a sudden, out of Ireland, you have a flood of people trying to get away, either getting over to Liverpool, settling in England, or getting over to Liverpool and then coming to America, or just taking ship and coming to America. The crop actually comes back in the autumn 47, but fails again in 48. So it fails 3 out of 4 years. Because we already had Irish in Vermont, because there was this trade link established between Ireland and Canada, this shipping link, right? A lot of these people came over via Canada. Then what happened in that, the worst year, really, in terms of the famine and what happened, was in that spring and summer of 1847, right? 2 crop failures. Now, people are desperate to get away. They get on these horrendous ships, right, that are just kind of hastily thrown together as passenger ships, and these are the ships that become known as coffin ships. They don't have hygienic facilities. The water goes bad. You begin to have typhus break out because typhus is carried in the water. People are dying on the ships. I mean, nobody knows how many thousands of people died trying to make that transatlantic voyage. There's a very interesting story about how Vermont was impacted by those desperate times. In 1832, the Canadian authorities on the St. Lawrence River had built a quarantine station because there had been some immigrants coming in the early 1830s with cholera. The Canadians wanted to keep out cholera, understandably, right? So they set up a quarantine station. And this is not like Ellis Island in the 1890s. Ellis Island was a processing station, right? All immigrants coming into New York went through it. Quarantine station operated like this. A passenger ship, a sailing ship, came up the St. Lawrence. A rowboat with a medical officer and probably a couple soldiers went out to the ship, was told to stop outside this island. The island is called Grosse Ile. That was the quarantine station. There's a little archipelago downstream from Quebec City. The health officer would look at everyone on the ship. If no disease seemed to be present, the ship was hailed on that it could continue on down to Quebec City or Montreal, wherever its ultimate destination was. If disease was present, people were taken off the boat. Those who were obviously sick were put on one end of this island, an island shaped like an hourglass. Right? Healthy people were put on one end of the hourglass. The sick people were put on another end, and there was literally a guard station right in the narrow of the hourglass because you didn't want the seemingly healthy people going on. Well, that summer of 1847 was a disaster on Grosse Ile. The Canadian authorities just could not keep up with what they were swamped with, and they had to bury Irish people in mass graves on that island, which you can see today. It's now a provincial park, Grosse Ile, and you can go up and take a boat out to the St. Lawrence and spend the day on Grosse Ile. There's still one of the original, what they called fever sheds on the island, right, where these sick people were put. And that year, I think I already mentioned it, right, they estimated that 5,000 people were buried on the island in that year. Now, how does this impact Vermont? Well, a lot of people that got through seemed to be healthy. Only later on came down with typhus. Many of them died on the docks in Quebec City. There's a very famous spot where many died on the docks in Montreal. There's a monument there to them. But some of them got even further before they came down. Next one. I'll read another quick piece. In the spring and summer of 1847, Champlain was an Irish lake. Sailing ships and steamers from St. John landed hundreds of famine survivors at the ports of St. Albans Bay, Plattsburgh, Burlington, and Whitehall. Many had passed through the quarantine station at Gros Isle only to come down with typhus as they reached their journey's end. Burlington found itself engulfed in a humanitarian crisis unprecedented in its history. There are no statistics on how many died of typhus in the Queen's City that summer, but there is much evidence of its widespread impact. In June 1847, Father O'Callahan, this was the first resident English-speaking priest in Vermont, wrote his bishop of the vast influx of immigrants who were prostrate with fever in every Irish house, shed, and barn in the village of Burlington, craving for the sacraments. And he went on to say that he had administered the last rites to 7 dying patients. What awful sickness and destruction is visible on all sides among the dying and the dead. Burlington's Poor Farm, a rudimentary facility used to shelter the indigent of the village, was hopelessly inadequate to meet the crisis. Usually home to no more than a dozen inmates, as they were called at the time. In the summer of 1847, it was forced to hold over 100, and hastily enlisted workmen quickly erected hospital sheds. At the annual town meeting in March 1848, the overseer of the poor reported that in the preceding year, the Poor Farm had administered relief to 1,508 individuals, 121 of whom died, and of the dead, 107 were Irish. He cited ship fever, that is typhus, as the cause of death in 108 cases. Other cases of ship fever were reported as far inland as Waterbury, Montpelier, Roxbury, and Royalton, towns that lay alongside the Central Vermont Railroad line then being built by Irish labor. The disease just moved along as the Irish went out to create jobs. Fine job. A couple of more points. As these Irish flooded in, some towns became overwhelmingly Irish. And there's a reason for that. The Irish went, as you can imagine, to where the jobs were. Number one, right, railroad construction was just then taking place in Vermont. Right, railroad construction began in Vermont in 1845, right, just prior to when the famine takes place. So just as the Irish are pouring in, there's a tremendous demand for not a lot of skill, just strong backs, right, to dig those rail lines, to blast rock, and so on. And the Irish went to those jobs, and that's where all of a sudden in Brattleboro, okay, in that late 1840s, you begin to have an Irish, significant Irish present in town, in Bellow Falls, anywhere where the railroad lines ran. At the same time, 2 other industries benefited from the coming of the railroads. One was the slate industry, right? Slate's a heavy stone. Before you had railroads, it was tough to get slate to a large market, right? It was tough to get slate to New York City, or it was tough to get slate to Chicago, right? As the West is opening up, right? But with the coming of railroads, all of a sudden the market for slate explodes, and there's a demand for all kinds of workers in Vermont's Slate Belt. And this is the Slate Belt: Fairhaven, Castleton, Poultney, Pollitt, just across the border in New York, which is, I want to say Granville? Granville, right? That's the Slate Belt of Vermont. Now, we always hear a lot about, well, they were all Welsh workers. Well, that's not true. In fact, in most of those towns, and certainly in the first decade, the 1850s, most of those workers, the majority of the workers, were Irish. Welshmen always had a reputation because of their slate works and being good slate workers. What one often found is that the foremen, the managers of the slate works, right, would be Welshmen. Not always the case, but that was a fairly typical pattern. One of the things that was interesting about the Irish Welsh workers, slate workers, is that many of them came from Tipperary. Tipperary has a tremendous slate areas in West Tipperary and down in the southeast Tipperary, around a place called Ahany, right? And even today, a lot of the Irish families that live in the Fairhaven area, they can all trace their, probably 3/4 of the family can trace their origins to Tipperary. So you can kind of imagine what happens. So someone, young man comes in, he hears, well, there's work on the railroads, right? And he works for a few months or maybe even a few years working on the railroad. He doesn't like this idea of moving around so much, so he says, well, you know, there's work in the slate works, and I know something about slate works over in Fairhaven, so he moves over there. So those areas become very Irish. The other great industry, extractive industry, of course, is marble. The early marble works in the 1840s, 1850s are almost to a man Irish. Right? The Italians don't come in until the 1880s or so, and the Finns, there'll be a fairly large Finnish population come in. Initially, it's all Irish. Now, to give you just a couple examples of how large the Irish presence was in the 19th century, and particularly in these areas. In Rutland Town, 1870, right, my favorite census again, 35% of the town of Rutland, 35%, right, were either Irish immigrants or their children. And that's actually computed data, right? That's not extrapolated on, you know, youngsters that may have grown up and moved away from home already. Pulteney, 22% of the town was Irish. Dorset, there are marble quarries in Dorset, right? Marble Mountain down there, 33% Irish. Bennington, the mills in Bennington, 24% Irish. Castleton, 33% Irish, and Burlington, 1870, is 20% Irish. Burlington's kind of interesting because in 1850, Burlington was 31% Irish. In the 1860s, with the Civil War on, with all the various kind of commercial works in Burlington, a lot of French Canadians. That's when the French Canadians really pour down into Vermont in the 1860s. So it's not that the Irish population decreased, it's that the Burlington population exploded, right? So their percentage went down. Overall, let's see if I have a figure for this. I used to have an overall. Yeah, overall what I found in 1870, about 11% of Vermont's population were either Irish immigrants or the children of Irish immigrants. And again, if you take into consideration people who came earlier, or children that have already grown up, moved out of the homes, who are difficult to know what they are, I'm guessing that probably 15, 18% of Vermont's population in 1870 was Irish. And obviously in certain areas, that population was much higher. Three last points. How did Vermonters feel about all these Irish coming in? Prior to the famine, I find the Vermonters being very welcoming. Vermonters didn't have much sympathy for the English system in Ireland. Of course, you have to remember that the American Revolution and the War of 1812 hadn't been that long before. Right? And Vermonters thought that the English had mistreated the Irish. But with the great influx of Irish and Irish Catholics mainly coming in the late 1840s and 1850s, sentiment changed, and you find a strong emphasis on nativism in Vermont. A lot of nativist politicians had a brief moment of popularity in the 1850s. That kind of comes to an end, though, with the Civil War. Because what you find with the Civil War is a lot of young, either Irishmen, men born in Ireland, or their sons going off to join the colors. and they fight right alongside Yankees and become friends, and it's pretty hard not to like